Welcome to Pause for the Truth, where you can sit back, relax, and hear an honest dialogue about health, wealth, legal, and social issues. The hosts are Dr. Rogers Kane, family practice physician, and Jocelyn Turner, health education consultant, with co hosts from the Northeast Florida Medical Society and its foundation. Stay tuned for the truth about matters affecting you and your family. We're here to tell you what's really going on and why.
Good evening, everyone. Uh, I appreciate everyone coming back and joining us again, including I still call a special guest, Dr. Kalina Sanders. And how are you doing, Dr. Sanders?
I'm doing great today.
Good, good. The weather was pretty decent other than hot. Got a little rain, but we needed the rain, so I cannot complain. I guess it rhymed a little bit. Didn't mean to. So let me ask, by the way, to the rest of our guests, Mrs. Turner will be a little late, but she'll be here joining us as usual. She's usually right at the last second, but right now she didn't make the last second. So, and then also we have, as you can see on the screen, I forgot what we called this stuff, Spody Rody, something to do with technology. How you doing, Mr. Jackson?
I'm doing well. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, we're glad you can join us and pitch it for Miss Turner for right now. So let's get this party started. This has been a conversation that I've been wanting to have for the longest. It's been more or less about trying to make the timing right. There's never good timing, but because of the urgency that I'm beginning to see in my office and the issues that are ongoing, I guess it's because of the baby boomer generation. So many of us baby boomers, none of you guys qualify for that, but so many of us baby boomers have begun to retire. You know, we already got old, but begin to retire. And then I think some of the realistic, real life settings of what happens when you get old is beginning to take its toll on not only the families, but also on society as far as it is concerned with medical expenditures and so on and so on. Something we'll get into in a bit more detail with Dr. Sanders. But Dr. Sanders, let me start off right off the bat. Can you briefly explain what dementia is and how it differs from normal aging? And then take it however you want to in terms of expansion.
Awesome. Well, I will start off by saying first that I think I've been on here enough times that I deserve a backdrop. Can I get a pause for the
Yeah, we're gonna get you a backdrop. We're gonna get you one. Because I expect you to use it in the future. So we're gonna get you one.
All right. My next one, I want the backdrop because I think it's cool. But thank you for the opportunity to come back on and really share kind of a pretty heavy topic, as you were mentioning. And it is something that we unfortunately are seeing more and more of because of the aging population. And so, Tyrone, how do I start my slides? Oh, there we go. Did I do that?
It looked pretty good the way it was. Okay, there you go.
There we go. There we go. And so as Dr. Keynes mentioned, that there really is a difference between dementia and what we see with normal aging. So one of the things that I think is most important distinguishing feature between them is the forgetfulness. So sometimes as we get older, our brains processing speed slows down, just like our motor function slows down. And so it may take us longer to get the information, but the information is there. But when what we see with dementia clinically is almost amnesia. You completely forget a memory or a function. And so I have another couple of sites that talk about it, but the main difference is with normal aging, the memory is there. It just takes longer to come out. Where dementia is, there is significant loss of the ability to recall information that was previously learned. Now, what I will point out though is many of us, even people my age, will forget why you went in a room. Like, I'm heading to the kitchen, I get to the kitchen and I forgot why I was coming in. That's not what we commonly are concerned with when it comes to dementia. That is what we call working memory. So that is a thought that's in your head that is highly dependent on how much concentration and attention you have. And if on the way to the kitchen you start thinking about something else, you get on your phone and you're texting on the way to the kitchen, that memory that is floating, or that thought that is floating in your brain, will go away. That's not what we're concerned with dementia. What we're concerned with is information that you've learned and and then you forget that. So that's a huge distinction. And so dementia, though, and forgetfulness is not part of the aging process. And that one of the things that we also look for when we are concerned about dementia is age. I'll talk about what some other risk factors are. But as a person gets older, we primarily start to think about it after the age of 65. Then we start to see an increased risk for dementia. Now, I'm throwing out the term dementia, but I think it's really important to highlight that dementia in itself is an umbrella term, and there are many types of dementias. Alzheimer's is the most common type of dementia, but I would like to highlight that probably the second most common is vascular dementia. So in patients who are people who have what we've talked about with our stroke podcast, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, high diabetes, they can get changes in the brain that can result in memory problems. And pathologically, that's different than Alzheimer's. But then there are frontotemporal dementias, there are Lewy body dementia, and then there are kind of some people that have a bit of a mix. But Dr. Keynes, what I'd like to kind of stress mostly today is Alzheimer's disease.
And I've read, obviously, where, being that I look at this stuff all the time, where 1 in 3 of our seniors die from Alzheimer or another form of dementia.
Mm-hmm.
Very significant. It's like the 6th leading cause of death.
It is. And for Black Americans above the age of 70, it's estimated that 21% are living with Alzheimer's currently.
Wow.
But I also think, though, that, and it's been noted in the literature, in our studies, is that sometimes our community feel like that memory problem is normal. And
Right.
So we are not going to the doctors, or we're not bringing our loved ones there, because we just think that what they're experiencing is just part of aging, but it may not be.
I've had patients to do exactly what you said. It's like, well, I walked in the kitchen, I forgot about this, that, or the other. And, and I usually tell them, like, yeah, well, it's probably part of normal aging. I don't try to blow them off, but, when they tell you something like that, you just kind of, let's just see where things go. However, I feel like I'm seeing a lot more dementia than what I've seen in recent, in previous years. And more recent years, not only seen a lot more dementia, but at earlier ages. I know you mentioned, 70 years of age, but I'm seeing them easily as young as 55, but the majority, at least they get to about 60 before the symptoms become so prevalent.
Hmm. The disease process of Alzheimer's specifically starts very early and oftentimes years before a person actually develops symptoms. And so some people, especially in those younger ages or early onset type of dementia, we or earlier ages, we kind of think more of a mild cognitive impairment. And so there is a distinct difference between mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. So when a person is coming in or wanting to bring their family in to the doctor's office, I think it's important that they understand kind of what are some of the signs and symptoms, right, of that. We talk about memory loss, misplacing things, or oftentimes putting things in strange places where they shouldn't belong. But it may be more than that. It may be difficulty with making decisions and judgment, confusion about time and place. And then it could be difficulties with problem solving. And those are the things that we ultimately get concerned with. So in that younger patient, they may have some forgetfulness, but what we tend to not see is the difficulty in decision making and judgment because they're oftentimes still employed and they're able to do their job okay. We oftentimes don't see that confusion or inability to complete complex tasks because they're managing households, they're running their kids everywhere, and they're doing those things. And if we, as we're talking to them, as physicians are talking to them, and we're trying to figure out where their level of function is, we might find that functionally that they're doing okay, and they may be presenting as mild cognitive impairment. Um, and
Can I ask you one quick question before you get to there? Two things. To elaborate on one of them is elaborating on the point that you just made. I have a one patient. I mean, they were highly functional pharmacists that was in charge of preparing IVs and infusions and stuff that took many calculations to do stuff that I forgot since I was in pharmacy school. But all of a sudden, they got to a point to where they can't. You ask them to do simple math and they can't do it.
mhm.
Okay, and you know, at some point, it happened to where the dementia became prevalent, but it was difficult for the family to discern when that happened.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so, and the last thing is Miss Turner. We'll go ahead and introduce Miss Turner. She's back this evening. We've asked everybody else how their day went. How's yours? Have been?
Tell the truth, Dr. Kane. You were happy that I was late so that you could be running this conversation tonight.
Right. Okay. Anyway,
I'm doing well, thank you.
Sanders, go ahead. I'm sorry to have interrupted you.
Oh no, you're fine. I think one of the things that we don't want to minimize what people are experiencing, but we want to understand fully where their level of functioning is, and that's very helpful for us to determine whether or not someone has mild cognitive impairment, which means they have some forgetfulness, but it's not really impacting their lives and their function. But as soon as the cognitive or the thinking problems began to impact their ability to function in their daily activities, then that's when we get concerned about dementia. And so really people kind of go through the phases of dementia. As I mentioned before, there's the preclinical phase where it's felt like the disease pathology is happening underneath the surface before a person becomes beginning to have symptoms.
Okay.
So, Dr. Sanders, I'm sorry if I am repeating some conversation that you've already had, but just to share that I remember when my cousin was diagnosed, he was, I think, 60 or 61.
Hmm.
And he didn't seem to live very long. What's the lifespan on once a person is diagnosed, and then, or is it depend on the other health conditions that they have?
So it likely depends on the type of dementia. So what we were talking about earlier is when we look at the term dementia, there are so many different types of dementia, and they all have different disease courses or symptoms, and they all have different prognoses. So when we think about Alzheimer's disease, the most common type of dementia, their lifespan or their time with the disease is oftentimes 10 to 15 years. So Alzheimer's seems to be a much slower progressive disease. But with other types of dementias, particularly frontal temporal dementia or Lewy body dementia, those tend to have more of a rapid or a fast disease progression. And so, depending on what type of dementia your family member has, kind of determines what we would expect for the lifespan of that person.
Thank you. And so are the memory games that I keep purchasing on my iPhone worth my money, or am I wasting my money on getting doing those? I do Scrabble, and I forgot the newest one that I've been doing. Is that really helpful?
Oh, definitely. I tell everyone, you think of your brain like you think of any other muscle in your body. The more you work it, the better it becomes, or the more you work and process information with your brain, the more likely you are to retain some of the function or the efficiency of the brain. So that kind of speaks to a lot of what we think about as the risk factors of dementia, right? And so I think lifestyle choices is a huge risk factor for dementia. So lack of mental exercise, lack of mental therapy, if I can think of a word for that, is key. Lack of physical mobility. So, exercise or lack thereof is a huge risk factor for dementia. Dr. Keynes mentioned that people are retiring. And so, in their retirement, they are doing less, they're thinking less, and that can kind of accelerate or bring on dementia type symptoms. And then there is vascular risk factors. So I mentioned before, blood pressure, cholesterol, diabetes can cause vascular dementia, but they can also precipitate and increase or accelerate the onset of Alzheimer's dementia. And then genetics. There definitely is a genetic component to your risk for having Alzheimer's. So if you have a family member, parent or a grandparent who had dementia or Alzheimer's, then there is a slight increased risk that you will also have it. But the truly what we consider hereditary forms of dementia occur when people are really young, even younger than in the 50s, Dr. Kane. There are some families in which there is a genetic trait that is passed on from generation to generation or from person to person, where they develop dementia in their 30s and 40s. But we do know that as part of the general population, genetics does play a role. And if you have a family history, that may increase your risk, which stresses the importance of dealing with all the other risk factors that can bring it on, like those lifestyle changes. So you are not wasting any money in doing those.
I'm
I'll
glad
let
you
Miss
mentioned
Turner
the.
know. Miss Turner, you need to have you do your physical exercise, but there are also brain exercises. And
Mhm.
when you
Yeah.
exercise them, that makes improvement on both ends.
And I'm glad Dr. Sanders, thank you, Dr. Kane, for saying that. I'm glad Dr. Sanders mentioned lifestyle choices, because when people retire for whatever reason, they think that's a hall pass to do nothing. But when in fact I look at it as an opportunity to do many things. right? All those things that perhaps you put off because of your work schedule, now you have the opportunity to really focus on your health. And I'm also happy that you clearly delineated the difference between genetics, the thing that we can't do anything about,
Mhm.
versus lifestyle, the things that we can do something about. And you echoed, and I'd like to echo so many reasons why we need to make sure we're managing our blood pressure, our blood sugar, our cholesterol. Those things are important for so many reasons. But also, I try to urge people that don't just rely on the medications to manage those conditions. We have to also do our part, because you're just making the medications, in my opinion, I'm not a clinician, you're making them work harder when you need to really, in fact, work smarter to reduce your risk of many different diseases.
I agree.
And that's my sermonette for the evening. Now, let me ask you another question. I think about, when you talk about younger people, is there anything that we should be doing with our families, say our children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, early on, as far as the family habits? I know Tyrone often shares the activities that he does with his children, but what are some things that we can be doing generationally that it becomes habit, other than exercising together as a family, of course, and eating healthy?
Definitely those two. I think communication and having conversations. I think we as socially, we as communities and families, we're talking less. We're not engaging as much, right? We're all on our phones. We're watching movies. We're playing games, but we're not talking. And I think going back and having a habit of conversing or having conversations with each other where you're sharing ideas, you may be debating. We kind of joke around a little bit, here on in the podcast, and those are the things that keeps the brain moving, keeps you on your toes when you're doing that.
Mhm.
And so I think that's important, is that we stay more engaged, and we do less isolation.
Well, Dr. Sanders, you said a couple of things that I do encourage my patients to do. Is like when they retire, it's like, okay, don't retire to die. It's what I usually tell them. Retire to live. Get out there and do something.
Hmm.
You can do volunteerism. You want to work, you may be tired of working for someone for the past 35 years, but that may be another job you want to do.
Hmm.
And when you retire, the beauty of it is a lot of times people don't have to work.
Yeah.
But when you're not pressured to work, then you're more likely to go out and enjoy any new activity, including working and getting
Yeah.
paid for it, or volunteering,
Yeah.
and which is a
Yeah.
payment different than actual monies, or volunteering to do that. Let me
Oh,
ask you, what can how is Alzheimer's diagnosed? I mean, I think that's what a lot of people want to have interest in. What
yeah.
do we do to make the diagnosis? I know what I do, but I want to know, uh, other than send them to you, what do you do when you get them, and what should I be doing?
Exactly. So obviously the first is awareness, right? Because many times people that have dementia are not aware or have any insight that they have a problem. So oftentimes it's for the family to be able to recognize that mom or dad or grandma is having memory problems and get her into the primary care where screening tests can be done. One of the more common screening tests that are done is called the mini mental status exam, or MMSE. And that is kind of a very high level look at the different aspects of cognition, including orientation, memory, language, being able to recall information. It assesses attention, and then it also assesses planning ability and a little bit of executive functioning. And so that can be done There's another screening test that can be done fairly quickly called the SLUMS, SLUM. And that can give you an idea whether or not someone is at risk for having dementia. And if either one of those are positive, then a referral to a specialist for additional testing. Now, when someone comes to see me, I will also repeat those screening tests. And I take the history of the patient, I take the history from the family, and then we do that screening test. And if it's clear by the screening test and the history that this person has a significant memory impairment, I may or may not send them on for additional testing. And what is that additional testing? Many times I will send patients on to have a more formal neurocognitive test. That's a test that's done by a neuropsychologist. And that test is about a 3 to 4 hour test to do. And so, but it goes into way more detail than what we can in the office. I will also send patients for evaluations to look for structural causes. And oftentimes that means imaging of the brain with a CAT scan or an MRI. And then we'll do blood work to look and make sure, if it hasn't been done already, to make sure that we're not dealing with a B12 deficiency or a thyroid problem or other types of infections that can affect the nervous system, like syphilis, that could potentially be the source for it. And then after I get all of those tests back, then I'm able to give an idea of whether or not someone has dementia. But what I always like to mention is that the true diagnosis is a pathologic diagnosis. So we actually have to look at the brain underneath the microscope to really see if someone has dementia. And so we don't do that. So we have to use other markers that can give us an idea. Now, more recently, particularly because of the approval of a recent medication, Medicare has changed their coverage of PET scans.
Yes.
And
Thank goodness.
go ahead.
I say, thank goodness, finally.
Yes, yes. So up until this last year, Medicare would not cover amyloid PET scans for people that had memory problems. And so now we have the ability to do it. And so that is also helpful for us to see whether or not a person has amyloid plaques in the brain. Can you pull up my slide? Because I did want to bring that up. There we go. So when we think about Alzheimer's and dementia, the pathology of it is again a microscopic. It's underneath the surface. Although we can sometimes see shrinkage of the brain on the MRI, the actual shrinkage of the brain is not really what tells us if someone has Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's occurs because people have the deposition or deposits of abnormal protein, abnormal substance in their brain called amyloid plaques. And the amyloid plaques prevents the nerves to transmit information that it needs. And so when someone has a lot of amyloid buildup in the brain, they aren't able to remember, have language problems, and cannot necessarily focus and do things. And so the MRI is helpful, but the PET scan now allows us to see if someone has amyloid plaques in their brain.
You know, a lot of people, I mean, I'm looking at this slide and it's very informative, but here's what I want people to take a look at, think about. And you can enlighten me and the audience on it, that each one of these nerve cells called neurons have multiple connections with other nerve cells, kind of like a neural net, like a fishnet stocking. All of them is interconnected to one another. And and you can correct me if I'm mistaken. They have hundreds to maybe thousands of connections to other neurons throughout the brain. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
when that amyloid gets deposited, it prevents the communication of those neurons with other neurons. And then eventually, if it gets bad enough, your memory starts to fade, yada, yada, yada.
Exactly. So we have 2.5, 3 million nerve cells in our brain. And in order for us to remember, one part of the brain has to talk to another part, and they are talking with multiple other nerves. And what I like to describe these amyloid plaque is as are like debris in the road, right? And so you might have one piece of trash one year, the next year you have a whole bag of trash in the road. And these debris, you have trees down in the road, they prevent you from one nerve cell to talk to the other. Like if you had one neighbor, they can't talk to the other or get to the other neighbor because there's stuff in the road. And so eventually, though, the debris gets so hard or high so much that it prevents all communication between one nerve cell and the next.
Can you
But you
tell us
know, I
about
look
tau
at
proteins? I'm sorry, because
yeah,
other clinicians are listening. If
yeah. I
we
have
talk
a
about
question,
amyloid, what about tau proteins?
Dr.
So,
Kane. I wanted to ask a question before you move to that and ask a question about the amyloid plaques, because when I think about medicine and what have you, is there any treatment that could break up that plaque in order to, or
We're gonna get to that.
is it so rapid and so much that that's the reason why it doesn't typically happen or can't happen?
the amyloid plaque and the deposition of it is only one piece of a pathway
Okay,
that results in the damage within the brain.
okay,
And as I mentioned before, this process likely starts years, maybe 5, 10, 15 years before a person even becomes symptomatic or have any inkling of a memory problem. And so there are other players involved, and I won't go into too much of a detail on cleavage and how these proteins are created. But yes, tau is another feature in the pathway of what this process is happening to create these abnormal bundles of proteins and tangles, and lays down the amyloid plaque in the brain. And so, yes, and we'll highlight that probably in the towards the end of where our treatments are, particularly our newer treatments. But I think it's important, and I'll link back to this in the future, is how why our medications aren't doing exactly what we want them to do is because the amyloid plaque is only one piece of the puzzle, and somehow there are other downstream and upstream things that are happening that contribute to it as well.
What are the different stages of Alzheimer's?
So it definitely depends on how you think about it. There are a number of different categorical stages that are used primarily for research. But I think, sometimes people can get bogged down into like the number of stage. I'm on stage 5. It goes up to stage 7, and really the determinant. I can't say the word. The determination of where a person is really depends on their level of functioning. And so we do the mini mental status exam, but the mini mental status exam does not really give us an idea of where a person is in their stage. What I like to classify it as is really mild, moderate, and advanced. Okay. And so mild Alzheimer's disease dementia is you have enough cognitive loss where it is impacting some of your activities of daily living, but your basic ones, like you're getting yourself dressed, maintaining your hygiene, maintaining your eating habits and your toileting, those are not affected. people may still be driving with mild Alzheimer's disease. They may require additional assistance like GPS to get them where they're going. But I have to admit, I use GPS all the time. And so as they start to lose function, though, then they kind of come into the moderate Alzheimer's disease, which now they are requiring additional assistance with things like managing their finances, maintaining their medication. So maybe they're starting to forget to take medication, and then they require a family member to help. But they can still take care of their bodily basic functions. And then the advanced dementia is really where we start to see regression, right? So they do not know how to coordinate and put on their clothing. So they're putting their pants on in their arms, or maybe they are forgetting to bathe themselves, or oftentimes they are starting to lose control of their bladder and bowel function. And so we see a lot of regression in that more advanced stages. But where you are on the spectrum is determined by what level of function you have.
That's testing that Medicare asks us to do on a yearly basis in terms of trying to screen for these types of dementia and stuff. But one of the things I do let family members know, and my staff, and I have to remind myself, I get, I spend a little bit more time with patients than a lot of physicians. That's why I don't make much money. But, you spend on an average 5, if the patient is really lucky, you got 10 minutes that they're spending with some of these primary care docs, okay? Because productivity is what the pencil index look at, but that's not necessarily what I look at. I guess what I'm trying to get to is that with those brief few minutes, you may not be able to pick up on something that's ongoing with that patient. That's why I'm always trying with my elderly patients be in contact with some family members to help them and they help me appreciate where that patient is at. And it's so critical. I mean, I got a guy right now, like 87, 88 years old. I can't find any family members. And my staff recognize he has some dementia-related problems. Because he come in that room with me and we talk about whatever. I mean, I go through the medication and stuff, and he kind of BS me or try to BS me in terms of what he's doing, because that's how Alzheimer patients tend to do. I'm on the front line, and that's why I'm just saying this. They tend to say just enough for you not to ask questions, okay? But if you're not paying attention, you would miss some of the obvious signs that might be with that might be happening with that patient. And not so much that we're trying to make that patient reveal what's going on with them in that little 5 minute, 10 minutes period, because they usually can give you a pretty good story and a pretty good front for about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
For about 10 minutes. But if you keep them long enough, they tend to start breaking down and you begin to pick up on it. And I'm saying that for the clinicians that are listening. You talk to them long enough, sooner or later you will get it if you're paying attention and not just typing on your computer.
Exactly. I had a patient several years ago, new patient. She came into my office, and she's talking about her job, helping out. And she's like, in real conversation, like they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing there. I have to do X, Y, Z. And then her sister comes in the room and she's like, none of that is true. None of that is true. And so family is extremely important. Caregivers, nephews, grandsons. I've had patients, bring in with them to kind of give us some of that additional information. But if a patient does not have that support, that's where I found home health to be extremely important. If they allow them in the home, first of all. But home health can have social workers, they can have nursing visits, they can look in the environment, and that can give you additional clues on where their level of function is.
So when is
no, go ahead.
when is it time for family members, I know all of us or many of us have aging parents, and sometimes it's the child that might be. I'm not necessarily, saying that this particular disease is associated with elderly people, but over the years, that's who we think is diagnosed more so than others. But now with everything else, people are having diagnosis early. At what point should people start going to the doctor with their elderly parent? I've known people who for years just were not involved. I remember when I got involved in my dad's health, it was when his diseases had progressed so much, right? And
Mhm.
had and I just didn't pay attention, didn't know. He masked it. There are so many reasons
Hid it.
why.
Hid it is what they
Mhm.
do. They
Yeah,
hide.
you know what I mean? So at what point, and you may have talked about it when you start thinking, because I think right now I have a family member who has memory issues, and they take Donna Pezzle,
Donepezil. Mhm.
Nepazil. I like my way of saying it, Donna Pezzle, Dr. Cindy.
I love
But
that too.
Nepazil.
We figured
But
out.
I remember initially they weren't taking it, right? When another family member noticed piles of it. And so now you wonder, this is why it seems, not that it stops it, but it helps allegedly. And so, and then it got to the point then when you mentioned a few moments ago that a family member actually has to watch them take the medicine
Mhm.
because they were not taking it themselves. But I think the hard part is getting the relatives, the children, to understand. If I am a health educator, for example, I've had to help my relatives understand the illness more than they do. Oh,
Mhm.
that's just their behavior. Oh, they're just being ornery and yada 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 yada. How do you help people understand the difference in just being ornery, but other and the reality that the dementia or Alzheimer's is indeed what's happening with their relative?
So obviously, the sooner the better, right? And so, in my mind, it's better to go get evaluated and have nothing than not be evaluated and have something big and bad going on. Tyrone, can you pull up this slide real quick? Because I think this kind of leads us into kind of why early evaluation is important. And that is because early time is brain in a sense. And so the earlier you can get the evaluation, the earlier treatment can occur. So when we look at kind of the age and time and cognitive functioning, there may be some mild loss in the very beginning, but then there comes a point where there is more of a steeper loss in this red line. And so if we intervene as early as possible, then we are hopefully able to change the course of the disease. And so this slide really highlights really kind of 3 or 4 different things that we need to consider. We already talked about the prevention of doing things like mental and physical exercises, controlling our diets, and those types of things. But when a person becomes symptomatic or we start to see a decline or a loss in their function, we have now really kind of 2 different ways we can treat dementia, which I think this is a great segue. So historically, as your family member, we have used medications that what we consider symptomatic treatment. That's the donepezil or the donepezil. There is another one called memantine, and those medications are symptomatic in the sense that they do not change the underlying disease process or disease pathology. So we talked a lot about amyloid plaques, debris in the road. These medications, donepezil and memantine, do not go in and clean out the debris in the road, they just really allow the healthy nerve cells to be able to communicate better. So in a sense, they give a nerve cell a bullhorn or a megaphone that they're able to talk with their neighbor through across the debris. But eventually, what we see with symptomatic treatment, which is the blue line, is it's helpful, but then it loses its efficacy. And so we start to see a decline even with symptomatic treatment. But more recently, we have what we call disease modifying therapies. And then and that may, again, change the course of the disease. A disease modifying therapy for Alzheimer's is actually a medicine that goes in and cleans up the debris. It cleans up the amyloid plaques in the brain. So early evaluation, as soon as we can, the more likely we're able to get people on the appropriate treatment that will hopefully help to change the trajectory or lengthen the amount of time that they have functional lives.
So that sounds like, not to put my relatives,
On blast.
primary care physician on blast or anything, because I would never do that, because they've been absolutely amazing. But who should be a part of my relatives' medical team other than, because quite frankly, I've only been involved in them going to see their primary care physician, but sounds like they need to see a neurologist.
Exactly. So depending on the level of functioning that they have, the primary care is the first point of contact, who should then refer out to a specialist like myself, a neurologist. And we may then incorporate other people, including the neuropsychologist, possibly a speech therapist that can do cognitive rehab if they still have a lot of insight in their difficulties. Sometimes that type of therapy can be helpful. But the first point of contact is really the primary care, who can then determine and send out to a neurologist.
Does it
Now, let
matter
me
if they're
speak to that being a
octogenarian?
primary care.
Wait a minute. Does it matter if they're octogenarian? Is it too late?
No,
No,
it's not.
Okay.
no. As a primary care, I need to just elaborate on a couple of points, because we're the first guys usually to see it, okay, other than family members. But a lot of times we see it before the family members, and I want to speak to some of the primary care physicians out there. Make sure your patients bring your medications in with them. A lot of times that'll tell you if they're taking it or not taking it. And they may not be willfully not taking it because they have an objection to it. They just may forget that they haven't taken it, or they think they have taken it. Okay. I would also go back to something that Dr. Sandra said. Home health care, to take a visit in the house, can look and see sometimes what is going on in the house. They can take a look and see if the food that you fixed for them the night before is in the garbage can versus, they have eaten it. Because you start seeing a lot of weight loss with some people, depending on the stage. But you start seeing weight loss because, believe it or not, a lot of them forget to eat. You just have to remember that. And when they forget to eat, if you make sure they got good food, or they may not be able to get good food, whatever it may be, they're not eating well, they start losing weight. Sometimes they isolate themselves because they're embarrassed about what is going on with them. They understand, some of them, not all, but they understand that they're having memory issues, and they try to hide it. They don't want people to know. Just think about it. If I tell either one of you, let's say, Miss Turner, if I walked in the room and hit you across the head and then walked out the room and then came back in the room, and you say, why'd you hit me in the head? You're going like, I say, I didn't do that. You're going to swear I'm lying upside down, inside out, every kind of way it is. However, when you're an Alzheimer patient and you tell them that they did so and so and so, it becomes a matter of disbelief. They all of a sudden, they don't trust you. They become very accusational, accusing you of stealing monies from them, taking their checkbooks, not, talking behind their back. all kinds of things that you need to look for that is out of the norm for that particular parent, relative, whomever it may be. You got to look at all different circumstances. And so one of the team members I like having on board with what I just said is a pharmacist to come in and keep very good track of medications. Are they taking it? How much remains in the bottle? Because if I gave you a prescription 100 days ago and you come in, you got 45 tablets of this medication, you're not taking it. But you will tell me you take it every day. So some of these are real subtle clues that you have to start looking at, and not to take anything away from Dr. Sanders, but because we have to get patients to Dr. Sanders for her to work her magic, we have to be cognizant of those things.
Well, one thing that Dr. Sanders said is getting them to allow the home health or the other services to come, because that's been the challenge with my family. The relative, they don't want to go anywhere, because I'm thinking about the things you've said. I've tried to get them engaged, say with other, senior services. They don't want to do it. The home health, no, because they're not trusting, as Dr. Kane said. They think that somebody's going to come in and steal from them, and so on and so forth. But you just see that they're spending too much time alone. And to me, that only makes the problem worse.
Nail on the head. You hit the nail on the head. Isolationism is a key part of worsening for the dementia.
It is. It is. But before I do have a couple of points also on kind of resources and for support. And I know we're kind of coming in on time, but I did want to highlight kind of one of the newer agents that has really kind of accelerated our ability to maybe have an impact on the Alzheimer's pathology. And if you can put up the slide for me, Tyrone. And that is a newer medication called Leqembi. And Leqembi is different than the donepezil and the memantines, where I talked about them being more symptomatic treatment. This is kind of one that is really felt to be a disease modifying therapy. And so when it was brought onto the market in summer of last year of 2023, it was actually the second agent to be approved. The first agent, Algeham, which also works very similar, was approved under a conditional approval. And what the FDA told Algeham is that they needed to do additional clinical trials. And so the only way a person can get on Algeham is if they were enrolled in a clinical study. But in the summer of last year, Leqembi got full unconditional approval by the FDA. And this is an infused therapy, which means a person has to go to an infusion place. They place an IV in, they drip the medicine through the veins, and it's an infusion that's given every 2 weeks. It's a fairly quick infusion. It takes about an hour to give, but it is every 2 weeks. And in the clinical trials, when we look at the level of cognitive functioning over the initial trial was 18 months, we see that there is a difference between the placebo group. So on this slide, the picture to the left, the gray line is the placebo group, and everyone starts at time 0. And then over the course of the 18 months, we do see a decrease in their cognitive function and cognition and function. But the pink line is the Leqembi group, in which we see that there is a less of a decline. So 27% decrease in progression over the 18 months. For Leqembi. And then when we kind of look at more long-term extension studies, the picture on the right, out to 24 months, we still see a decline over time, but definitely a difference between the group of people that we would expect to happen if they weren't on medication over that time period. Now, what I like to highlight is what we don't see is a plateau of the line. We don't see that the cognitive function improves. We still do see a decline in their function, but it's less compared to placebo. Now, we have to balance whether or not this type of treatment is the best treatment for a person who has Alzheimer's. Because one of the main things that we have to evaluate for in someone who is on Leqembi is an entity called ARIA. And it's ARIA. It is amyloid related imaging abnormality. And so for some patients, when this medication removes the amyloid out of the brain, it can cause swelling, and sometimes it can cause bleeding or hemorrhages.
Is that dose related?
Huh?
Is it dose related? I'm sorry.
It's not dose related, but it does seem to happen earlier on in the treatment course. And so oftentimes the edema and the hemorrhage is mild, asymptomatic. But there are some patients that have a specific genetic abnormality that increases their risk for this ARIA to occur. So because of that, a person has to have an MRI before, they have to have an MRI after their 5th infusion, their 7th infusion, and their 14th infusion. And so to look for that abnormality. For most people, it's mild, it's asymptomatic, and it goes away. But those are the things that, as a neurologist, when you send them my way, particularly with interest in Leqembi, we are going to be evaluating whether or not that risk-benefit ratio is really appropriate. And Leqembi is really for patients that have mild cognitive impairment and early dementia. So once someone is in the moderate and late or advanced stage, this is not an option for them. Okay, so the earlier, the better.
Some people, I mean, there's a couple of questions that we have. I'm going to ask them right quick. One of the person made a statement: isolation is oftentimes unavoidable due to working loved ones, and we're going to address to some degree next week on terms of assistance with Alzheimer's patients. But they're absolutely correct. You know, these family members that are also caregivers and so on still have a job of their own to support themselves and or their families. And so it becomes very difficult trying to balance the needs of that Alzheimer's patient with the needs of the caregiver as it relates to their families and their own personal issues. That was my answer to them. Is there anything you want to add to that, Dr. Sanders?
Yes. And so oftentimes the difficulty with these support services, so in someone in whom has, unable to care for their loved one throughout the day because they are employed, there are resources that are available. There is the Council of Aging that can help provide day programs where you can take your loved one there and they can be watched and exercised and have some structure to their day. There are obviously home services where you can pay someone to come into the home to be a sitter and also engage with your loved one. But oftentimes those are very costly endeavors and sometimes are not affordable, but they are there. The Alzheimer's website I'll throw out there has a lot of wealth of information for caregivers for understanding and resources that are available. And I would like to highlight, and hopefully Dr. Kane, maybe we could work to get access to my friend and actually my former patient's daughter, who created a handbook about what happens with different symptoms and how she approached the different things that caregivers go through. when they're caring for someone with Alzheimer's. And so Dr. Monica Hardy has been a wealth of resource for those caregivers. And she also has a Facebook page, and she's there to kind of help guide people through what it is to care for someone with Alzheimer's. And she has that book that's available as well. And so the caregiving of and support of an Alzheimer's patient is not an easy job. It's not.
So,
and coincidentally, I'm sorry, Dr. Kane.
Go ahead.
I've actually gotten someone from the Alzheimer Association and Elder Source to agree to be on the podcast next Tuesday.
Oh, awesome.
And if this young lady wants to come, we can extend an invitation for her to be here as well. But it's kind of up to them.
Yeah. we'll see. We'll see what we can.
Right.
We'll see what we can do.
Right, we can do. Another question was, these medications cross the blood-brain barrier?
Yes, so the monoclonal antibodies that are there to remove the amyloid absolutely do cross the blood-brain barrier, as well as the donepezil kind of really works on an enzyme, acetylcholinesterase inhibitor. It is a acetylcholinesterase inhibitor, and so it works chemically inside the central nervous system, which is why we get the benefits, as well as the memantine.
So somebody asked, Alzheimer's made worse when a person is at home alone. I think we kind of addressed that. That's one of the things that we were saying, isolationism. When they're left at home, that's that would happen. And I think Dr. Jones asked, is there a reversal of symptoms?
Right now, there isn't anything that reverses the symptoms. Really, where we are is slowing down the progression.
Anything in the pipeline on reversing the symptoms?
I think there was a lot of optimism that, if we remove the amyloid, then a person's cognitive function might improve. But as I mentioned before, the amyloid is only one part of the process, and that there are probably other features, including tau, that might be contributing as well. So future renditions of these types of medications may start to target that and may make a difference. But right now, what we're finding that we're still just slowing down the progression.
Wow, this has been absolutely amazing, Dr. Sanders, and a lot to digest, quite frankly, particularly for folks who have a family member or relative or friend or what have you who has been showing some signs of dementia. It's tough. It's really difficult to deal with for people who have parents or spouse. Children have a hard time seeing the changes with their parent, and then also the parent not accepting the children intervening and wanting to still be the parent.
I'm the dad. You don't tell me what to do.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's the thing that I see in my relative. Tyrone has a History Maker Minute that we want to show, and then Dr. Sanders, we're going to give you an opportunity to give your final thoughts regarding tonight's topic. Take it away, Tyrone.
Welcome back to Pause for the Truth. It's Tuesday, July 16th, 2024, and this is our History Makers Minute, where we spotlight the trailblazers who are shaping our world. Today, we honor Dr. Lisa L. Barnes, a cognitive neuropsychologist whose work is making a profound impact on our understanding of Alzheimer's disease. Dr. Barnes is not just a scientist, she's a champion for health equity. As the leader of the Minority Aging Research Study at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center in Chicago, she's dedicated her career to unraveling the mysteries of Alzheimer's in the African American community. Dr. Barnes's pioneering research has illuminated the unique ways Alzheimer's affects Black individuals, challenging long-held assumptions and paving the way for more inclusive and effective treatments. Her unwavering commitment to diversity in research is changing the face of medicine and ensuring that everyone has a voice in the fight against this devastating disease. Join us as we celebrate the remarkable achievements of Dr. Lisa L. Barnes, a true history maker who is transforming the field of Alzheimer's research and advocating for a healthier future for all. Stay tuned for more inspiring stories on Pause for the Truth.
Dr. Sanders, that brought up a couple of things for me real quick, because I know, we promised you we're going to get you out of here, and we've already went 6 minutes over.
We're fine. We're fine.
So are you doing any clinical research on Alzheimer's patients?
I personally am not. We do have another physician in our practice that is participating in some research through the Jacksonville Research Institute, Dr. Tenges. And so there are ongoing clinical studies looking at the different agents in our city.
Well, that's interesting. And we may ask of you to give us information for patients who may want to include their loved ones in those kinds of studies. Just remember, one of those studies passed your primary care physician and or your neurologist, okay? And two, that we be open-minded as to what it takes to participate in clinical research. Nothing is guaranteed. And a lot of times we are making and paving the way for others to survive a disease, whatever it may be, Alzheimer's or, MRSA or something for that. That's what we're doing. So keep in mind, clinical research is not bad, as some people think it is. It's great to participate. Of course, because I trust Dr. Sanders, if she points me in a direction, which direction to go, I will most certainly adhere to it, because she's proven herself to be an excellent neurologist and a person that's very concerned about her patients, and albeit my patients as well, because my patients wound up seeing her. So that's pretty much it in terms of the questions that I have.
Yeah, Dr. Sanders, I do have one final question. And again, I apologize. I know I was late, but does race matter?
Yeah.
Does race and or gender matter when it comes to a diagnosis of dementia or Alzheimer's?
Gender and race is what she said. So it was two different things. Go ahead.
Yes. So the answer is a maybe, and I will echo what Dr. Kane said. Is like the participation in clinical trial research and any type of research is very low for African Americans, right? So when we look at the Leqembi trial, less than 5% of the patients in the trial were African American. And so the answer is there may be a difference, but we don't know. I think it's probably maybe more of a racial difference than it is a sex difference. I think that we commonly see dementia and Alzheimer's almost equally in males versus females, particularly if their vascular risk factors are the same. But we might see that there may be some genetic differences between African Americans and Caucasian Americans, but we don't know because we're not participating in those studies. And so that was going to be my final thought, is to echo Dr. Kane about really not steering away or being too hesitant about participating in trials, because that's how we know it works for us.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
You just prompted another thought. So the more you talk, I think about something else. So a friend of mine, their parent had dementia. So should she and her siblings is there a test or something that they can take to see if they're at risk, or what could they do in order to maybe perhaps identify if they have some sign of it?
You mentioned ApoE protein for me. for
Yes,
clinicians
so
as well?
I did not mention specifically that there are some blood tests that may potentially show if someone is at risk, but I think it's important to know that without symptoms, those tests really don't have a lot of value and could potentially put too much information out there that may prevent things like insurance, life insurance, even sometimes health insurance. And
Excellent.
so if you're asymptomatic, I always caution my patients on going and doing those genetic testing, because just because you have the genes doesn't mean you'll have the disease. And so you don't want to really do that until you begin to have some cognitive concerns.
Creates a lot of bias toward your clinical issues, your insurability. You know, if you, especially when you're young and you got kids and you want to
Mm-hmm.
purchase a life insurance, I just want to reiterate that. Want to
Mm-hmm.
purchase a life insurance, you know, that's why sometimes, a lot of times, I'm not in a hurry to run out and test people or call them with dementia too early, you know, at a very young age.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just want to make sure that people, I'm glad you mentioned that, Dr. Sanders, that, you know, not all testing is good for you. You know, sometimes you get a test and then it's like, okay, so what I'm gonna do with it now? You know, it doesn't really provide you with any additional options in terms of treatment, but it may actually discriminate against you in terms of other aspects of your life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, we are 10 minutes beyond the hour, and obviously it's a very complex conversation and complex disease, in my opinion, Dr. Sanders and Dr. Kane, but nonetheless very important. And I'm not sure, Dr. Sanders, if you've given your final thoughts, but if there's anything else you'd like to share, please go ahead and do so as we near the end of the show.
The only thing I will say is awareness for family members to see the issues in their family and take them to be evaluated. The sooner, the better. As I stated earlier, it's better to get the evaluation and have nothing wrong than not get the evaluation and you've lost time and you've lost brain.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Sanders. Dr. Kane, what about you? What are your final thoughts regarding tonight's topic?
Quick as I can, I'll piggyback on what Dr. Sanders said, and that is that, have your family evaluate, have your loved one evaluated if you can get them to do it. Have them evaluated. Talk to their primary care physicians, and just give them, if you think something is going on. Sometimes I know you don't want to mention it in front of the individual, and so sometimes it may behoove you to at least call. I listen to what you tell me, but I may not respond to it because of patient privacy, unless you're one of those people that the patient has given me permission to do so. So, and then as far as clinicians are concerned, I definitely want them to make sure they go back and look at those patients and kind of think outside of the box what may be going on with those patients when they come in and have late refills or haven't taken their medicine for a while, or where their blood pressure was controlled and then all of a sudden it's not controlled. You step back, look at it. It may not be applicable to that person, but at least you should put a thought in your mind. Do I need to look at this person for this without accusing them or calling them out as being demented? Also, other causes, and then I'm talking to other clinicians, don't forget the other causes of a mental, what's the word? Decompensation, whatever. That you may need to make sure that there's not a urinary tract infection or some thyroid issue or some other metabolic issue that can affect what's going on with that patient. And the last thing is, and Dr. Sanders may or may not have an opinion on this. I look at microplastic and other environmental issues that may be part of the problem. I know we don't have an absolute answer to it, but I'm always looking at possibilities because possibilities may become facts down the road. So, microplastic is something to keep an eye on because it's in our lives every day.
Yeah. I have to look further into that.
Yeah. Yeah. And feel free, because you can educate me on it as easily as, and I'm happy about finding out the truth.
So
That's
again,
why we call
thank
it
you,
pause.
Dr. Sanders, and thank you, Dr. Kane. Dealing with dementia and a loved one can be challenging for families. And here's just some simple advice that I would like to share with all of you. Educate yourself, as I hope you've done on this podcast from Dr. Sanders and Dr. Kane, learning about the different stages of dementia and its symptoms. Understanding the condition can help you empathize with and better support your loved one. Communicate effectively. Use clear, simple language. Be patient. Listen actively and give them time to respond. Avoid arguing or correcting them too harshly. Create a safe environment. Modify the home to reduce risk of accidents. Remove tripping hazards. Install handrails and ensure good lighting. Establish routine. Consistent daily routines can provide a sense of stability and reduce confusion for the person with dementia. Engage in activities. Encourage participation in activities they enjoy and can still manage. Take care of yourself. Caregiving, as you all know, can be demanding. Ensure you also take time for self-care and seek support from friends, family, and support groups. Seek professional help. Don't hesitate to reach out to healthcare professionals for guidance, whether it's for medical advice, therapeutic support, or respite care. Legal and financial planning. Early on, discuss and arrange legal and financial matters. Ensure that wills, power of attorney, and healthcare directives are in place. As usual, thank you for tuning in to Pause for the Truth. Next week, we will continue the discussion regarding dementia and memory issues with our guests from the Alzheimer's Association as well as Elder Source. Thank you. Good evening.
Tyrone? Music, excellent. You done played it already.
We can continue.
And there we have it, another episode of the Pause for the Truth podcast in the proverbial books. Our heartfelt thanks go out to every one of you who took the time to tune in. Mark your calendars, we're here every Tuesday at 6:30 Eastern Standard Time. Feel free to join our community on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. But the golden ticket? Subscribing to our YouTube channel. That's your passport to all our latest episodes and exclusive content. A special mention to the wizard behind the curtain, Tyrone Jackson from Call Tyrone IT Services. His technical prowess and unwavering dedication are the backbone of this podcast. Next week, we'll be back with more.